Dr. Ye Tao at Harvard University's Rowland Institute joins us today. And I have a question or two about the project that you are directing, the MEER project. That's MEER. First of all, where can we find the MEER project on the internet?
So first of all, thanks for the invitation. You can find the MEER Reflection Project by entering www.meerreflection, reflection.com.
That's great, thank you. And so that provides a web-based home, at least, for the MEER Reflection Project. Now, can you give us an overview of this project, the outline, the timeline, in layperson's terms? How would the MEERs work? On land, in the ocean? What's the whole approach here?
Yeah, so the approach is to first step back and ask the question of, when you have a planetary scale problem, what can we do at sufficient scale to address such a gigantic problem? So first of all, we need enough material to make any impact. So we look at Earth and ask, what are the most abundant elements that can be found on Earth? And among the top elements, you find silicon, oxygen, and aluminum. Then we think, basically, we need to focus attention engineering to leveraging these elements. So that's point one, where you find the material. The second point is we want to most efficiently address the most urgent problem facing humanity, which is a planetary overheating. So in essence, we have a certain amount of heat trapped in the atmosphere that allows everything to grow and prosper. If you have too much heat trapped, then it's disaster. You have too little, that's also disaster for a civilization that's accustomed to the current level or pre-industrial level of heat. So heat arrives and leaves. Traditionally, people tackling climate change have been focusing on trying to open the outlet, the IR radiation, by trying to draw down or clean up the atmosphere. That's a very laborious process and energy intensive process. But you can achieve the same effect by closing a bit of the inlet. And that's what Project MEER Reflection is trying to do, by rejecting selected portion of the coming sunlight back into space. So that's how the basic idea. From a conceptual point of view, when we're trying to reject light using mirrors, it's a two-dimensional engineering problem because light reflection happens on a two-dimensional plane. That's rather manageable compared to a three-dimensional volume of the atmosphere and the ocean that we need to sift through and filter. So that's a much bigger operation from just engineering practical point of view. So we first of all look at the two possible solutions at the inlet versus outlet. We select the one that's most simple conceptually and in practice, the 2D problem rather than the 3D. And then we look for the abundant materials we have on Earth to implement such a strategy, which is to use glass made of silicon and oxygen predominantly, and with a thin film of aluminum. We need only 10 to 100 nanometers of aluminum coating to have it basically achieve 80 to 90% reflectivity. So to give you a sense of how big that is, your cell is probably 10 micrometers, and the thickness you need is 1/100th of the thickness of your cell. So by compressing a three-dimensional problem into a 2D problem, we achieve significant cost and material saving. And this conceptual leap, I would say, is what makes MEER reflection affordable and scalable.
So I've heard some conversation about implementing MEER reflection on the ocean or on land or some combination of the two. So can you walk us through the advantages, disadvantages, where you think this would be best applied?
That's a very good question and one that we're currently investigating. So mirrors, the simplest one is just a piece of glass you put outside in your backyard, laying horizontally. So let's assume we were just to encourage everybody to go to Home Depot or Alibaba.com to buy some mirrors and lay in their backyard and ask the question, which country are blessed with the highest efficiency? So it turns out here's, well, as expected, equatorial regions, tropics are better places. But it turns out that the ocean are actually much better in general. The reason is the amount of heat or light available for rejection is the difference between what's coming down on the ground minus what is absorbed by the ground or the ocean. So it's this difference. The oceans, well, they have very low albedo. So you get intrinsically like very little light reflected away. So you have a lot of potential to reject the amount that's normally absorbed by the ocean by putting mirrors in the ocean. But of course, from a practical point of view, it's much more difficult to make mirrors float in the ocean. So it's a more involved engineering challenge. But you get roughly a factor of 2 to 3 improvement in cooling efficiency if we were to implement the mirrors in the oceans, compared to if they were just laid out in somebody's backyard up here in Boston or in the Northeast.
And how large an area are we talking about here? Because I'm guessing even if it's a relatively big backyard in Boston, 1 yard is not going to cover it. So how much surface area do we need? And how does that compare with, say, the size of Boston or Massachusetts or whatever?
Okay, that's a very good question. So calculations show that you need roughly 8 by 8 or to 10 by 10 feet square of horizontal mirror laid out, say, in the sunny areas with low background albedo to offset 1 ton of CO2. So that's roughly 100 square feet.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what's the average roof space per person in the US. It's probably on the order of a couple hundred or a few hundred. So that basically shows if all the roofs or backyards were covered, we can offset for on the order of month to years of emissions. So that's certainly not sufficient. So that also shows that while the concept works, it's a transition step towards moving to mirror-enabled renewable energy production, which would essentially make further construction unnecessary as the amount of emissions go down. So we talked about horizontal mirrors, but it's also possible to increase the efficiency somewhat by tilting the mirrors towards an angle that's more perpendicular to the direction from which the sunlight arrives. So that calculation is ongoing and will lead to a factor of maybe 2 or 3 saving in space.
Mm-hmm. And are we talking here square miles, square kilometers, the size of North America? Give us some idea for the size.
So the area that needs to be covered on an annual basis right now, assume we continue 2019 emission rates, would be the surface area of Belarus.
Oh, okay.
Per year.
And that's to compensate for the amount of emissions that are happening as of 2019. So if we could actually do something like reduce emissions, heaven forbid, yes, then we might get away with a little bit smaller area.
That's exactly right. So that's why at MEER reflection, we are very busy developing engineering technologies, energy production and food production schemes enabled by a large MEER and glass manufacturing capability to move toward a carbon neutral economy.
Okay, changing the subject a little bit. Can you explain the difference between MEER reflection and carbon sequestration?
Yes. So as we mentioned before, to tune how much heat is trapped in Earth, we have the outlet and the inlet to play with. Carbon sequestration is a way to open the outlet by removing heat-trapping gases from the atmosphere. MEER reflection is a way to do the same thing by closing the inlet. So carbon sequestration and MEER reflection can actually work together. And we think MEER reflection can actually enable the most efficient carbon sequestration scheme possible. So carbon sequestration works best for concentrated emission sources. For example, coal-fired power plants. The reason being that once we allow the CO2 to escape into the atmosphere and freely mix, there is a process called entropic mixing. Basically, it takes work to sort M&Ms of different color, but it's very easy to mix them up. So it takes energy to do the reverse. Calculations show that the amount of energy that humanity needs to invest to reduce atmospheric CO2 concentrations back to safe levels of pre-industrial levels is more than what the world consumes in a single year, and that's the theoretical number. Any thermodynamic engine or process is never 100% efficient, and our current technology will only enable on the order of 5% efficiency, which means 20 years of world's primary energy consumption is necessary in order to capture CO2 from the air. And that's a huge problem because it's even difficult to even spend 1% or 5% of world's energy primary consumption to do any mitigation efforts, which means we're looking at timescales of centuries if we were to entertain the idea of direct air capture. So that's why in terms of carbon capture and sequestration, the only sensible source or emission sources are concentrated power plants. So that's step one. So that's potentially feasible for power plants. But the problem is once you capture it, where do you put it? And that's a common problem facing the field. In the US, for example, I think based on the Drawdown Conference 2019 I attended, we have on the order of 100 megaton of storage space that we know can be utilized. And that's less than 1% of what the world uses per year. So it doesn't seem likely that we will ever be able to find enough storage space even for 1 year of emission. So as a result, carbon capture storage, while it's possible to capture, it's not really feasible to store. That's why people are looking at ways to turn CO2 into solid form, such as by mixing a little bit into concrete or into giant reactors and into rocks, so they undergo geological transformation. The problem with those schemes is that they are not scalable to anywhere near what's necessary, regardless of the amount of investment. So the only utility for carbon capture and storage, the only part that's useful is the capture part. Once you capture it, you have to somehow make it into something we can then use ourselves. For example, one of my colleagues here at Rowland, who recently joined the faculty at Rice University, is an expert in converting CO2 into usable fuel, like methanol and C2 carbons, like ethylene, using electrocatalysis. So it's a very promising field. The scale, obviously they need to scale up dramatically, but at least in principle, they achieve good energy efficiency for the capture process. Then the question is where the energy comes from. And our answer to that is, of course, solar energy, a combination of both heat and partial conversion into electricity to power the circuits that run these CO2 reduction reactions.
People who claim I'm depressing have never listened to you for very long.
I mean, the scheme, the technology exists, but the right combination of schemes is not publicly known. Yeah. And right. Even if known, the challenge is a human one, a political one, not a scientific or technical one.
Right. Okay, so that leads right into the next question. I want to talk about immediacy, about how quickly things can be implemented. What are the immediate benefits of implementing MEER reflection in conjunction with active global emissions reductions? How soon do we start to realize either a reduced global average temperature or removal of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere that then have an impact on global temperature?
So that's a very good question because it highlights the how MEER reflection differs from any other solar radiation management schemes out there. So if you just put not even MEER, a shade or umbrella above your head on a sunny day, you will feel an immediate coolness and you will cool down in the immediate vicinity. So MEER reflection is a scheme that can be implemented locally to have a local benefit and cooling effect. And at the same time, also have the global effect projected out to the world. So I would say it's for, say, farmers in a field struggling with retaining moisture for their soil, or just having temperatures consecutively over 30 degrees Celsius, or 100 plus days that's killing their crops. By having a fraction of the field covered, they can basically enable continued agriculture by both helping to retain moisture at lower temperature and favor the efficiency of photosynthesis and the water transport mechanisms in plants by keeping temperature below 30 degrees. So it's immediate.
They've used similar techniques like that. For instance, at the Biosphere 2 in Arizona, they're using solar panels to collect energy and to provide shading for more sensitive plants.
Correct. Yeah. I think it's a field called agrovoltaics.
Yeah.
The combination of photovoltaics with agriculture. Right. And so in the case of MEER reflection, the benefit will be even stronger because photovoltaic panels have an albedo of less than 0.1, whereas mirrors have albedo of 0.9 or plus. So it's even better.
When you started your response to my question there, I thought you were going to start selling umbrellas. I'm glad you went with a more pragmatic, larger approach. Would the MEER project be successful even if no emissions reductions took place? And I have a good idea what the answer is here, so this is for the rest of our viewers.
It would be successful at achieving temperature stabilization. It would not if, well, there's different parts to MEER reflection. So let me be clear. If we were only to implement the MEER for cooling purposes, then it would be successful at stabilizing the global temperature, but it wouldn't stop acidification of the ocean, which is a next urgent problem once we have the temperature under control. So the time of emergence of ocean acidification problem on a wider scale would be roughly by the 2080s and beyond. So we have a bit of more time to tackle that. But if we somehow didn't change our fossil fuel usage habits or source provenance, then we would continue marching toward the secondary problem of ocean acidification. That's why at MEER Reflection, we have a team working on coupling MEER technologies, human energy needs with the need to deacidify the ocean. So the scheme works like this. Let's assume for a second that everybody became seafood lovers and we could eat oysters and clams and scallops all day.
You are.
You are? Okay, great. So some recruits right there. So if we could convince everybody to eat these bivalves for most of their nutritional needs, then we would, certainly we have enough area to cultivate that, that's for sure. These guys don't require much area to grow, especially with like 3-dimensional scaffold growing techniques. So we'll have heaps of shell left over. So these shells traditionally have been treated as a waste to be buried or to be disposed of. But actually, let's use them as a resource. So bivalve shells are predominantly calcium carbonate. So we can basically limestone. We can use solar heat ovens to separate the shell into the calcium oxide component and the CO2 component. So the CO2 gas that evolves from this thermal decomposition process is generally of high purity, above 95% pure, which can be almost immediately used in fuel synthesis, for example, for our aerial vehicles and automobiles and ocean liners. And the calcium oxide we can take to, say, a new type of power station or heating station for cities. We can add a bit of water to it. It will become calcium hydroxide. And the process releases a lot of heat for people who have, done the experiment or worked with concrete. So our calculations show that, assume that we had such a gigantic agriculture industry to supply food this way. The amount of calcium oxide we derive is sufficient to power everybody's heating needs in the world for space heating. And when you do this decomposition process, happens at high temperature driven by the sun. The CO2 gas that evolves from it is at a high temperature as well. So you need to cool it down before you can use it. It's pretty simple to just pass the hot gas through a heat exchanger to heat water. And our calculations show that this cooling process provides enough hot water to satisfy roughly 80 to 90% of the world's hot water needs. So this scheme is interesting because it satisfies all of our nutritional calorie needs. It satisfies the entire world's space heating needs and hot water needs, which together will remove on the order of, I have to check back the numbers, but on the order of like 20% of emissions as well. And on top of that, the CO2 that evolves, if we use that to make fuel to power our cars, then we achieve a circular economy in terms of both the calcium element and the carbon element.
That's great. Who gets to make the money off of that, though? It'll only work if someone's going to make money off of it.
Well, that's the question.
Kevin Hester has a really wonderful question, and I'm just going to read it to you, if that's all right.
Yes, of course.
Since we're talking about the oceans. He says, as an ocean-going sailor who has completed 16 ocean passages on small yachts, 30 to 75 feet, I have a reasonable idea how vast the oceans are. I struggle to comprehend how this proposed system can be scaled up to justify the EROI of manufacture, deployment, and maintenance. Have we any EROEI calculations? And how does this compare to marine cloud brightening? I think you answered a lot of those.
And EROI, he means energy return on energy invested.
Okay. Somehow your screen froze up, but I will.
So did yours.
Okay.
You're not just sneering at us.
You guys look perplexed. Yours. Okay, so
standard setting.
Yeah. So there's a couple angles from which we can look at this question. So one question is, making anything requires energy investment and CO2 emissions in the current infrastructure. Okay, so let's first do the calculation within the current CO2 emitting industry infrastructure. So to make glass, we need heat that's produced from burning fossil fuels. 1 ton of glass requires about 4 to 5 gigajoule of energy to make. And in the end, we emit roughly 1 ton of CO2 for 2 tons of glass manufactured. But it only takes like 5% of a ton of glass to offset permanently the heating effect of 1 ton of CO2. So if we take the ratio of 1 divided by 0.05, you get 20, at least 20. So even using current technology of fossil fuels, we basically offset 20 times the amount of CO2 as is required to produce it. Now, assume in the future that glass and mirror manufacturing catalyzes a transition to concentrating solar thermal energies and concentrating solar thermal furnaces. Those techniques emit CO2 at roughly 10% of traditional coal burning power plants. So then we have to multiply the number 20 by 10, which means we achieve an efficiency of times 200 over what's invested.
That's great.
That doesn't sound like such a bad deal. Is there some sort of catch that we're missing here?
Oh, well, I don't know. Well, probably generate some jobs. People have to go tour the mirrors and clean them once every few years. But there's some maintenance cost, of course. Yes.
Right. And what about the marine cloud brightening? How does this compare? How do you think that would compare to the marine cloud brightening, which I don't know enough about?
Okay. So before we talk about marine cloud brightening, let me go back to the second angle from which to look at the mirrors. So we talked about how much CO2 is produced versus how much is offset. Now let's consider the infrastructure as a planetary AC cooling system. So in AC cooling, you generally ask a question of how much energy you remove from a room versus how much electricity energy you input into the machine. And I think the ratio, if the energy removed, generally it's, I think people give that in British thermal units, a very ancient unit, but the electricity input is usually like watt hour or kilowatt hour, but they still take the ratio of those two energy with different units. But anyways, so I think typical machines achieve a ratio of 30 to 1. So 30 units removed per 1 unit input. So that's pretty good. Cooling is much easier than heating. That's why most energy is consumed heating. Now let's apply that to the mirrors. So our calculations shows that if you put a mirror on a sunny day, in the desert or somewhere like that, it takes roughly a week for it to reject enough solar energy compared to the amount that's used to make it a week, which means over a year, it rejects 50 times as much energy as was required to make it. Over 10 years, it's 500 times. And more and more as time goes on.
Right.
So which brings up a very important metric that we hold in our project, which is durability of stuff, quality of stuff. So this scheme is different from the others in that once you make it right, it stays there. And the longer it stays, the better, the more efficient it becomes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So whereas contemporary solar panels might last 30 years,
maybe
these things last how long?
So the minimum lifetime we know we can achieve is at least 30 years, because in the field of solar mirrors based on glass and silver even, over 30 years, people haven't observed any measurable degradation over 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we are confident that with the engineering expertise we have in the group, that over a century is no problem. Of course, there's a vandalism, that's you know, and if you want to remove them to, you know, restructure your land use, but in principle, glass is a very durable material, and empirical data exist supporting minimum 30-year lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So that brings us back to the question about marine cloud brightening, and many other similar geoengineering concepts. So we reviewed that for the in the MEER case, you make it once and it lasts over the time dimension. In the case of marine cloud brightening and also aerosols in the stratosphere, these operations need to continue over time, continuously. So the cost accrues over time, integrates over time, and the energy expenditure integrates over time. Equipment wear integrates over time. So that's a crucial, I think, qualitative conceptual difference.
Yeah, both of those projects, stratospheric aerosol emissions and marine cloud brightening, remind me yet again of Tim Garrett's work at the University of Utah, Civilization as a Heat Engine. And those are playing right into the overheating process. How are you going to get the marine clouds brightened? That takes energy, quite a lot, actually. Okay, another question from skeptical Kevin Hester. He writes, I have sailed through rafts of pumice that have been ejected from submarine volcanic eruptions. So large areas of pumice floating on surface. They quickly develop algae on the submersed side of the pumice. So what's the technology for righting the mirrors so that they aren't constantly accumulating algae and reducing the albedo?
That's a very good question, because it's something I believe requires engineering and research work that's not yet carried out in my group, because we're still at a ramping up phase of the project. So I have reviewed the literature on marine anti-biofouling, and it's a very active area of research. And the best surfaces right now can resist up to over a month of submersion into the ocean without significant algae attachment. So there's several approaches in the field for achieving that. So biofouling, first of all, is a surface phenomena. We put an interface, a solid substrate into the ocean, then things like to attach to the surface. So there has to be a surface contact initiation phase before things can anchor themselves and grow larger colonies, whether it's bacterial or algal or whatever. So then one can think of, how can we prevent any contact in the first place? You probably know of Teflon pens. They don't stick because they have compounds that are terminated by fluorines. So that's one way to make coat surfaces, to make them non-sticking. And that's been shown to be somewhat successful in preventing or slowing down the attachment process. But it hasn't been completely efficient over the timescale of years that we're talking about. So that's one approach. In the field, it's called superhydrophobic surfaces. Basically, they loathe water so much. If you drop a droplet on them, the droplet will ball up into a ball and bounce around. So they're called superhydrophobic.
You're not just saying that because it sounds cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. There's some nice videos. Like one of the professors I collaborated with on some project at ETH Zurich has I think a Nature paper a few years back when I was still a PhD student showing droplets bouncing and jumping. So that's one approach. Another approach actually invented here at Harvard in, it was based on, I think, mimicking some plant in nature. I don't remember, but if you have like little tiny hairs on the surface and then coat a sort of liquid that imbibes these little hairs, then you would have already created some sort of liquid air interface. And one can imagine using a layer of oil. I think those surfaces are called SLIP, S-L-I-P. I don't forget what the acronyms mean, but that's another approach used to make surfaces really slippery. So if you have these little hairs trapping oil or some fluorinated compound, then water organism wouldn't be able to attach themselves because it just very greasy, feels very greasy to them.
Right.
So that's another approach. The problem with this approach is that because your interface is essentially an oil layer, it's still amenable to degradation as individual molecules of that oil get slowly dissolved into the background environment. So lifetime challenge seems to be the limiting factor for that approach. And I think based on my review of the literature, the most promising surface right now are nanocrystalline diamond surfaces.
There you go again.
Here you go again, yes. So it's the most efficient, but I haven't thought of a way to scale that up because the reaction temperature required really requires high temperature and wouldn't be a good investment of our energies. But it's active. I would like to once again point out that Kevin's question is a very good one, that it's still a problem to solve, how to prevent attachment of barnacles and algae on the bottom side of the mirrors. However, on the top side, where the functional properties of device really matters, it might be easier to resolve problem. For example, we could use self-cleaning technologies, nanoparticles of titanium dioxide, which is rather cheap, and because of titanium is rather abundant and you don't need too much. These can activate different species like water molecules, making them into hydroxyl group, for example. These would have biocidal effects to keep the surface clean. So I think on the front side, it's probably a more manageable problem on the short term. How exactly to prevent the backside of mirrors from ever getting, fouled by marine organisms? That's a long-standing challenge in marine biology and transportation field. I think we basically waste maybe 10–20% of fuel in shipping because the hulls of ships get covered by these barnacles. Yeah, but it's an exciting area of research and one that I have some experience in during my grad school. So one of the projects we did was to invent a way to prevent silicon surfaces from growing an oxide layer. So that turns out to have a pretty important applications in nanotechnology, nanoscience, because as the dimensions of things shrink down to the low nanometer scale, there's a very thin layer of what's called native oxide. For example, aluminum is very resistant metal that resists rusting because it naturally rusts a tiny bit, like a few nanometers. So it's already rusted, and that prevents further rusting. The same thing happens to many metals, semiconductors like silicon. And these interface chemistry and properties are something like we are also quite excited about working on, especially at interface of these surface technology with biology and engineering.
Say I'm Jeff Bezos, and I'm talking to you, so you feel good already. Feeling hopeful.
Yeah, sure.
So imagine I'm Jeff Bezos, and I decide that I have a few $1 billion too many.
I'll take it.
I'm talking to him. What's it take? How quickly could this idea be put into practice? How soon can we have MEERs on the ground, as it were, or MEERs in the sea, and reflecting at least locally? And then ultimately, how soon would it take to scale? If money was not any sort of constraint, if you could hire as many bodies as you needed, if we took a much larger than World War II approach to this whole thing, and you're in charge, then do we the day after tomorrow, next Tuesday? How long?
So I guess if we really want to do it right, in the sense that we will be trusting in the longevity of the infrastructures, then the R&D time is on the order of 3 years, with a team of on the order of 100 scientists working in about 10 teams. So the number of roughly 10 teams is based on the current structure of our project of about 8 different teams of young scientists. Yeah.
Okay, let's say that I've determined that I'm Jeff Bezos, and I've determined that we don't have 3 years. We have a much shorter period. We don't know, of course, how long we have, but I think time is very critical. So I'm Jeff Bezos. I have all this money at my disposal. I'm going to throw it at you. How soon? How soon can we start cooling at least the area where Jeff Bezos lives?
Well, that's basically immediately. I think the current global glass manufacturing capability is certainly sufficient, at least to supply a state or even country level cooling annual output. If we, decide as a civilization to channel existing capability to perform this task, but of course, the eventual planetary scale impact has to be coordinated by, first of all, ramping up glass manufacturing capability and developing glass manufacturing based on ideally solar thermal means, so that the technology can replicate itself. But if people are interested in preserving local climates, or just that can be done immediately, basically.
Could Jeff Bezos collaborate with the production of these types of mirrors that could go into people's backyards, and they could just purchase it, subsidized perhaps, on Amazon, and have it installed in their backyard? How feasible would something like that be?
What if everybody decided this was the 2020 version of the mini skirt from the 1970s, so everybody wants in?
The thing is, mirrors, for example, that you deploy on land are not that complicated to make. So the manufacturing cost is very, very low. You can log on to Alibaba right now and offset 1 ton using at the cost of roughly $6 USD today, and just put it into your backyard. So because basically the low cost ensures that it should be very easily financeable scheme, but we need still a level of coordination at the level of at least several key countries in order to make it, sustainable for the planetary enterprise we're hoping to achieve.
If every teenage girl in America got over their narcissism for 10 minutes and took their mirror from their bathroom outside, that would have a full impact in a short period of time. That's what you're saying.
This is really an incredible idea. I'm just like, I think this is amazing that it actually could be that simple. But I do have another question for for pilots flying over fields of MEER. Will that affect them in any way, do you think?
So the main risk for mirrors pointing up is if they were somehow pointing the light in the same direction and focusing it in a spot. That's actually very difficult to achieve and takes a lot of engineering, and that's what's done in concentrating solar power stations. So it's a deliberate act. If it's only flat mirrors or randomly placed, it'll be very difficult for such a thing to materialize out of random, again, by entropy tending to bigger numbers. So what could happen is you could see two moon or two suns, one the real object, the other the image. But in such a cases, you only get twice the amount of sunshine compared to normal. So probably it's might be a little uncomfortable, but I suspect airplanes are equipped with thermal control mechanisms to make that a non-issue.
Yeah, cool. All right, so do you have any estimates how much time this MEER project could buy us? In other words, everybody asks Guy this question. When are we going to die?
Certainly within the next, I think 50 years for most people old enough to comprehend this question. So I guess based on that metric, MEER reflection will buy them eternity. No, sorry, but anyways, so the physics is clear that if we get the heat control in place, and if we move away from fossil fuel carbon economy, but going to a renewable carbon economy facilitated by MEER technologies, then in principle, it's possible to achieve sustainability in the sense that if somehow we manage to close all the geochemical loops. But that's a next step challenge that we need to consider after we address the most urgent need. It's no easy task to achieve that sort of new equilibrium given the degree of disturbance ecosystems has suffered as a result of our inattention to our real place in this environment in the world.
Yes, and the acidification of the ocean is probably a really important thing because that's our
to address. Yes, yes, but those are addressable problems. I think the next most difficult challenge after thermal and acidification problems are controlled would be education of the population, especially from a technological and STEM point of view, because it's sometimes difficult to make arguments based on physics and the math, basically what runs this universe, to people who have not received the appropriate exposure to the fundamental principles. So aiming to raise the literacy about science, technology, engineering, and math would be the next challenge.
Forget it. We're dead. Forget it. That's not.
Yeah.
Math.
Yeah, so, yeah.
Oh, that's a tall order.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. That's basically, that's why I mentioned the human challenge is the bigger challenge.
Yeah.
But it's, yeah.
That's always been the biggest challenge.
The biggest, yeah.
Getting people to think in bigger, in a broader perspective rather than their own little narrow.
Yeah. Thinking beyond their own individual lives.
Yeah.
That's tough.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ye Tao from Harvard's Rowland Institute. Remind us once again where we can find the MEER Reflection Project.
It's basically www.meerreflection.com. So reflection is a reflection, and MEER is MEER, and it stands for MEERs, for Earth's energy rebalancing.
Excellent.
Because Earth is out of energy balance, in a state of energy imbalance. We seek to restore that energy balance.
Right. Thank you very much for the conversation today. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to speaking with you again.
Yes, it's a pleasure talking to you guys always.
Right.
All right, we'll cut it right there.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was great.
Did we have some good material to show, I guess?
Amazing.
Oh yeah, I don't think you understand how scientifically illiterate the general population is. And your ability to describe in clear language this project is great. It's very impressive and much needed because people are just willfully stupid.
They want to do the right thing, though.
Yes.
People keep asking, can we plant trees? Of course, it won't make that much of a difference, but plant them.
Yes.
Because of the scale.
Yeah, it makes people happy. I think that's
right. Well, yeah.
Everybody wants to know that they're making a difference,
Yes.
a positive difference.
Yeah.
And most people don't have the slightest idea how to go about that. So give them any tail to chase after. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I love the idea of the mirrors that you can just, if you could create a project where people could just put them in their backyard or on their roof.
Mm-hmm.
That's incredible. That's a really...
Yeah, people would grab on.
Yeah.
It would be the thing to do.
Right.
It'd be like doing something useful instead of joining Extinction Rebellion.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, Roger Hallam's agent. Do you know who Roger Hallam is?
Yes, I have seen him speak.
He's one of the founders of XR, and he's an organic farmer, and he has an agent.
Huh.
That's interesting. And he contacted me months ago, 3 or 4 months ago, and several other people. And Extinction Rebellion has their own television station, their own television show.
Wow.
Really?
It's becoming a sect.
Yes, exactly. And so they wanted me to be involved in this thing. And I said, yeah, sure. And so, and then he didn't respond, and he didn't provide a date, and he said it was going to be, pretty soon. Yeah. And then months go by, and I'm just pinging him every couple of weeks, and still available if you want that to happen. And then just a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, he writes to me and says, I'm just out of prison. You've been in prison this whole time.
Oh,
that's why he wasn't responding.
He needs a new agent, basically.
No kidding. And you want other people to do what you've been doing? You haven't told them the part about where they get thrown in prison for 6 months, have you?
That's
jeez.
Yeah.
So he's not allowed to check email or anything during the prison?
No, not during that time.
And that's British prison, probably. They're a lot stricter.
That's if we get thrown into prison, that would be quite disastrous.
Yeah.
Yes.
No computer. Oh no. No work gets done anyway.
Oh, God, no.
And I spent quite a bit of time in various incarceration facilities. prisons, jails, and so on. When I was in the Poetry Inside Out program, when I was teaching poetry. And it, you know, we always used to come out of there and we'd be sort of depressed looking at the conditions these people are subjected to. And so we would always revert to, because humans are innately hopeful, I think, we would always revert to, at least they have a lot of time to think. They can write all day. But wow, yeah, there's such a thing as too much time to think. I've got it already. It's pretty brutal.
Well, we don't want to keep you anymore if you need to go.
Anyway, thanks.
So
yeah, I'm pretty open. If you want to, like, I don't know, if there's more questions, I'm also available to.
That's all the questions. And if we post a video longer than an hour, nobody watches anyway, because it's not like attention span.
Do you have anything that we didn't ask that you'd want to share?
I guess you guys covered a lot of bases, I think. Yeah.
All right.
Great.
So we made it all the way to home.
Yeah. So, like your listeners, like, who are these people? Do you have a sense of who they are?
They're over 50, mostly male.
Why? Interesting.
And educated.
Huh. Okay.
That's on our channels. We don't know about Gary Knowles' radio station, do we?
It's about the same.
Is it?
Yeah.
People who have time on their hands.
Yeah. People who have, you know, they are usually white, entitled, and privileged, so they have the time to listen.
For a few years,
some research.
The Progressive Radio Network broadcast out of Manhattan. And so it had to adhere to FCC regulations. And they haven't done that for a few years. But when it was broadcasting there, I imagine their audience was every conceivable person and demographic in the New York City metropolitan area. But subsequently, they've scaled back because they can't afford to maintain the license.
Right.
Which is the way it goes.
Yeah.
When you're interested in spreading real evidence.
No,
there's no money for that.
There are also, there's a very unique group of listeners that are younger. They're in their 20s. And they are often environmental students from universities.
Ecology, environmental.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they're very focused and they're very curious. And I think they'll really enjoy this and appreciate the work that you're doing.
Let's see how long I can keep doing this.
I know.
That's the trick.
That's the trick.
With every academic research enterprise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's tough.
It's such a gigantic waste of time just to, you know, to write proposals to convince or educate people who have no clue about what's going on.
Right. That's why I think it is. I know that it's so much faster, and if you know how to push the right buttons to attract the attention of the rich folks.
Yeah, that's right. So just one person, you know, 100 million order, then we're set to at least do the demonstration phase.
Right. The postdoctoral program, for which I was the inaugural director in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, the David H. Smith Fellows Program, he just threw billions of dollars at them with very, very few constraints. Like in the first year, and at the time, the Nature Conservancy was really good at turning money into more money. So I had a $3.5 million budget when I arrived. That's how much money was in the bank.
That's nice.
I traveled 2 to 3 weeks every month. I was there for a year. I poured as much money into this thing as I could possibly come up with. And at the end of the year, I had $4.5 million.
What?
How did that
You didn't pour enough. It would have been like 10 million.
In part because I was an academic, so I'm accustomed to pinching pennies, you know. So every time I got to eat, I'd order macaroni and cheese. And I mean, It was crazy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that's where the relatively unconstrained money can go and take care of real important projects. That's why I've been pushing so hard to get those assholes, I mean, those producers to connect. They say they have connections to Jeff Bezos.
How much did you say you needed for the project? 20 million?
20 million to just the setup for a year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
60 million for 3 years of solid R&D.
Right.
That's pocket change.
Right.
Yeah.
For the likes of Bezos and Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and a handful of other people in the United States alone. And some of these people have got to be interested in preserving habitat for humans on Earth.
Yeah.
They just
it's just hard to reach.
I know.
It's not possible. There's a barrier somehow.
Yes. Oh, they put those barriers in place for a reason.
Yeah.
Well, and you think about how many people are trying to get through. You know, there's probably millions.
Yeah.
You know, and
there's a lot of people trying to get a hold of that money.
Right, and only a fraction of them are worthy. Some of them are going to get through, and then the rest of us are going to like keep banging our heads against the wall.
And you can imagine the initial thought of regarding every proposal coming in is, this is a nut job. This is some nutty professor submitting this stuff. That's got to be their default setting with every single proposal that comes in. Because how much crazy must they get? I get a shit ton of crazy every day, and I don't have any money.
Yeah, but I think they filter that sort of thing, you know. And I think if we can just get your foot in the door, I think that will happen. I think that it will happen.
Within about less than a month of working for the Conservancy, I went to their annual meeting of not just their staff, but the big money. So they put on a big show. So I go to this meeting, I'm allowed 5 minutes to give a presentation about the Smith Fellows program. And somebody with the last name of Proctor, as in Procter and Gamble, asked, would it help to have more money? That's the first question I got. I'm just yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't heard that question since, by the way.
What year was that again?
It's 99.
Okay.
I was there during the academic year 99-2000, basically.
So you're partying like it was 1999.
Exactly.
Because it was. Wow.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Oh, thank you. Let's see what comes out of it.
Now, the radio show doesn't broadcast until the first week of November. So we're going to hold this whole thing until then and broadcast the 10 or 15 minutes on as part of the radio show. It'll air live at 3 p.m. Eastern time on the first Tuesday?
Yes. The first Tuesday of the month.
Tuesday of the month. So the first Tuesday of November, whenever that is.
Okay. I guess you will be editing